Episode 1 of The Last Kingdom Season 5 starts years after the events of last season. Brida has been forgotten by most, with her daughter now older and an army starting to grow by her side. Uhtred hasn't forgotten her though, and knows that she'll return one day. With a blindfold on her child, Brida tells the silent crowd that the girl is a seer and is going to choose one among them. And that person is sacrificed to the gods for a safe voyage off the island and for battle. In Runcorn, the border between Mercia and Northumbria, Uhtred senses that something has changed, claiming the air is rotten. Athelstan is a bit older now too, and with Blood Month upon them, he intends to slay a beast to show his worth. Uhtred approves it and off he goes, cheering into the woods. Instead of a beast though, Athelstan finds assassins lying in wait trying to kill him. After besting two of them, the third flees into the woods. When Athelstan heads back to the alehouse to celebrate his victory, Uhtred sees birds drop out of the sky in a really ominous sign. Off the back of this, Uhtred has his concerns, and when an unidentified ship is spotted turning into the riverbed, the army is prepared. Some believe it's Ragnvaldr, but he's up in York with Stiora and Sigtryggr, drunk and convinced that the gods have saved him, mumbling that he's changed. And as he speaks Icelandic and paints his face white, I think we know just how he's changed. He's in lieu with Brida. Anyway, the ship down in Runcorn belongs to Edith, who wants to trade. She shows up and for now at least Uhtred is at peace. After paying her respect to Alfred, Athelflaed shows up. It's all smiles from Sinlef though, as he marvels at Lady Elfwin's beauty. Uhtred does the same for Athelflaed. However, she's also there with a new priest, Father Benedict. Rumor has it that he lost his riches in Rome. He heads outside and gives a sermon, but something stirs. Rumors are abound of Danes attacking along the coast. Raiders have been spotted with white markings, and when Uhtred learns of this, he realizes this spells trouble. And it doesn't take long for that to surface. Uhtred's son has been stabbed, and as he stumbles up to Uhtred, he blurts out that Brida is responsible. In Winchester, Wessex, the assassins trying to kill Athelstan were actually hired by Athelhelm, who remains determined to put his easily influenced grandson, Elfward, on the throne. For now, the lone assassin is tasked with standing down as Edward continues to rule. His political scheming is still prevalent though. That scheming comes from Ragnvaldr inviting Brida and her men into York, where they begin slaughtering the peaceful Christians. Stiora is urged to hide in her chamber by her maid, as Brida remains determined to try and find her. Episode 2 of The Last Kingdom Season 5 starts right where we left off, up in York with Brida's men determined to try and find Stiora. Stiora and her maid manage to kill a single assassin, but unfortunately Sigtryggr is all alone in his battle, fending off the warriors feebly and forced to yield. Brida cuts a lock of his hair off, and as Ragnvaldr goes off looking for Stiora, who manages to evade his threat fleeing through the tunnels. Unfortunately another maid is not so lucky, and Brida slits her throat. Brida also wants to kill Sigtryggr, but to prove his loyalty, she has Ragnvaldr do it. He's not exactly pleased about killing his own brother, but with her watching on, he does just this. Before Sigtryggr drowns though, Brida stops him as he's proven his loyalty. As for Sigtryggr, she tasks him with bringing Uhtred to her. If he can do that, then she'll spare Stiora's life. So off he goes, under the pale moonlight to find Uhtred. In his absence, Brida has her people on their knees and forces them to suffer until she presents herself. Stiora's maids urge her not to move, but it's clear she's conflicted. Down in Runcorn, Uhtred's son's life hangs in the balance, while his father is sprung tight, knowing Brida is back. When he catches wind of what's happened up north, he realizes she's coming for his bloodline. Uhtred wants to attack York with Athelflaed's military, but she refuses, only offering a dozen or so men to go with him. Uhtred is shocked, but not as shocked as he will be when he learns that Athelflaed is facing death. For now, she keeps that a secret. In Winchester, Athelhelm also catches wind of what's happening and senses an opportunity for Edward. He believes that Edward should regain the land, and doing so, he'd extend his kingdom. He wants Sigtryggr dead and wants to use Brida to make that happen. Edward refuses, but Athelhelm warns that the Ealdormen are not going to be happy with his decision. So naturally, Athelhelm decides to work behind his back, sending word to the Saxon boroughs not to give any troops or support for Sigtryggr under the banner of the king. In his absence, Edward starts to grow closer to a lady from Send called Egifu. As fate would have it, he actually has ties to her going back to his past. Edward encourages her to eat with him, but while they get along well, Athelholm is not happy. He tries to pay her off in the morning, but she confronts Edward about this. Edward apologizes on Athelholm's behalf and points out that he's kin and has friends in high places. It's not easy just to abandon him. Edward does, however, encourage her to stick around for a while. Down in Runcorn, Finan learns about Athelflaed's imminent death and urges him to keep quiet about it. That's a rough secret to keep though, given he's never kept anything like this. Episode 3 of The Last Kingdom Season 5 starts with Stiorra presenting herself to Brida. Ignoring the pleas of her people, she promises Brida that God will not forget and demands she fight her one-on-one. Unfortunately, Stiorra's closest mate is killed in front of her as a warning. Just before they fight, Uhtred heads in with his men through the tunnels, getting the jump on the soldiers patrolling the perimeter. However, they notice the fight outside and prepare to strike. With their forces set up, Stiorra looks set to meet her death from a vastly overpowered Brida until Uhtred strikes. As the two forces trade blows, Brida and Uhtred face one another. Vibeke wanders into the middle of the battlefield though, prompting Bride to take her aside and tell her to hide until after the fighting is done. Unfortunately, Vibeke ends up on the roof, and as Uhtred urges her to take his hand so as not to fall, Brida encourages her to jump into her arms. Vibeke jumps, hits the edge of the roof hard, and collapses on the ground, dead. Brida is devastated as she realizes her daughter has passed. Athelflaed's forces show up to help tip the scales of this fight, with Uhtred's men opening the gates. Brida's army retreats, while those left behind meet a grisly fate. Rognvaldr is spared from death though, while Uhtred's decision to keep Brida alive leaves a trail of dead bodies in the woods, leading away from the town. For now Brida is gone, but it's clear this is far from over. Sigtryggr blames himself for letting them in, but also Edward too. Given the Christians haven't arrived to help him fight this battle, Sigtryggr believes Edward doesn't fully support his cause. Stiorra suggests they form a bond together, with Uhtred pledging his allegiance to Sigtryggr and helping him. Uhtred refuses, pointing out his home and loyalty lies with Runcorn. Meanwhile, Father Benedict joins Athelflaed in her camp in Egelsberg. The thing is, he's been feeding information to Athelholm, given his earlier debt he needs to replay. Edward, however, is still close to Egifu, who stays the night, but reminds him she needs to leave before anyone spots them. After all, if his wife sees them then that could be problematic. When she leaves in the morning, Athelholm appears and reveals to Edward that Athelflaed is dying and won't see the spring. So naturally, he decides to go to her and ride out to Egelsberg. In the morning, Uhtred intends to set out and track Brida down, but Finan speaks up and decides to tell him about Athelflaed after all. Uhtred encourages Stiorra to join him as he rides to her, but she refuses, pointing out that her place is with Sigtryggr. Athelflaed's health continues to deteriorate, and she's moved to Aylesbury, in the Kingdom of Mercia. With Athelflaed fading, Elfwin is brought before her and urged to become the Lady of Mercia. Athelflaed wants her to take up this position to keep things politically stable, as well as remaining vigilant over any enemies that could come their way. Lord Aldhelm is also tasked with being Elfwin's guide, urged to do right by Mercia given they need him. Unfortunately, news of this spreads, and as such, so too does the political scheming from Athelholm and the ealdormen who wished to upset the balance of power. Athelholm is preparing a coup to place Elfward on the throne as Lord of Mercia within the week. However, his scheming is overheard by Egifu, as he promises a wighting will take place when Athelflaed dies. Edward is immediately informed, realizing that he must have bribed the Mercia ealdormen. Meanwhile, Rognvaldr is to be tested by the gods, forcing to hold a burning bar and take 9 steps. If he's successful, then Odin will spare him. If not, then he's cursed. As he holds the bar, the episode comes to a close. Episode 4 of The Last Kingdom Season 5 begins to Rognvaldr taking his 9 steps. Dropping the hot bar, his hands are singed after completing his task. As he calls out in pain, Sigtryggr gives him 3 days to heal up, or it'll become clear that the gods have left him to die. Uhtred rides up to see Athelflaed, who's at least healthy enough to get dressed and tend to her obligations. Otter joins her, but Ethelflaed's sudden burst of energy is only indicative of how little time she has left. She visits one of the Ealdormen, paying them off with land and urging them to help protect Mercia no matter what. Ottred is concerned about Elfwin taking the throne in his lover's absence, but agrees to keep Ethelflaed's promise to help watch over her. Holding Ethelflaed's hand, the pair head out to the wilderness and talk. Off in the Yorkshire wilds, Breda continues to torture Father Perlig, tying him up to a tree and promising that his death will not be quick. Numerous cuts cover his body as he's told to pray. Pray for Vibeke being brought back. Perlig instead prays for Breda's life. She suddenly drops to her knees and begins sobbing, pointing out that she's alone. Perlig gently reassures her that she's not. In Winchester, news of Edward and Egifu's relations begin to spread, including to his wife, Elfled. Ollys encourages her to leave and as such, they ride together. Edward is already gone though, and he arrives to see his sister. Once there, he runs into Elfwin who worries about the Ealdorman scheming. Edward promises to do his best to thwart this, as Uhtred returns holding Ethelflaed's body. She's passed away and as he somberly walks with her, a slickly shot montage cuts in with scenes of Breda also mourning the loss of Vibeke. Father Perlig prays for her passing. Meanwhile, Rodmildr's wounds start to heal, but for Sigtryggr, he's struggling to forgive his brother for betraying them. Still, the gods have forgiven him and as such, it seems like they're on the way forward. Funnily enough, Athelstan happens to be here too, and he's reunited with his father. It's an icy meeting, to say the least, but for now Edward decides against reunions, given more pressing issues are at hand. Those issues stem from mourning the loss of Ethelflaed and sorting out Mercia for her successor. Elfwin decides to follow her mother's wishes, but of course Ethelhelm's appearance is not a good sign. He wants the bells rung immediately to signify the passing of Ascension. Edward delays but does eventually ring them. While they're all gathered together in Ethelflaed's chambers, soldiers show up outside, which immediately puts Athelstan on high alert. Thankfully Uhtred and the others see this coming and Ethelhelm is stopped. Edward kills the corrupt Ealdorman working with Ethelhelm and decides not to put Elfwin on the throne. Instead, he's going to become king of the Angles and the Saxons, uniting the two lands himself. This is something Alfred dreamed of too, which Uhtred reflects on as Ethelflaed's body taken away. Episode 5 of The Last Kingdom Season 5 begins in Aylesbury, with news of the Ealdorman dying spreading across town. Lord Aldhelm decides to leave, as civil war teases on the horizon. Egifu encourages Edward to resolve this by making peace with everyone in Mercia. He's going to break bread with the people to show he's merciful. After all, ruling in fear is never the way. Ethelhelm is reduced to the shadows for now, but remains determined to try and get his grandson on the throne no matter what. His plan is to set up a war between the Christians and the Danes, with the hope that Edward will die in battle, allowing Ælfweard to ascend. In York, news of Edward's coup reaches Stiorra and Sigtryggr as they symbolically remove the install cross and prepare to fight if it comes to it. Out in the woods though, Lord Heston finds numerous priests killed, with Ollys sobbing for her life. She's been spared to pass on word that Sigtryggr is coming, and part of that message includes Edward's queen hung from a tree. Over in Buxton, Elfwin and her grandmother show up to offer the former life. And that comes in the form of Sinlef being married to her. The news is passed on by Father Benedict, but unfortunately everything is put on hold when Heston shows up. He's not there to fight though, and he takes Uhtred aside, gravely speaking of the attack on the road and of the queen's death. Uhtred is not so sure Sigtryggr is responsible, but realizes that if word of this reaches Mercia, it would cause a huge battle between the Danes and Christians just like Ethelhelm wants. Sigtryggr is actually pretty disgusted when Uhtred rides out and quizzes him over this, pointing out that he'd do a lot more than strangle the queen if he was the one fighting. While this is going on, Breda encourages Father Perlig to lead her to Uhtred. After all, if she's to make peace with herself, the only one to do that is to go straight to the source. When Ethelhelm fails to convince Edward to recklessly march into battle, he undermines the king by spurring on the people, spouting that Danes are responsible for the deaths, and they should get revenge. Ethelhelm's coup works, and the angry soldiers show up en masse looking for the Danes. Finan urges that Uhtred and the others be informed, but in the ensuing fight, Osferth is stabbed and killed before the soldiers are pushed back. When Edward finds out about the losses sustained from the attack, alongside his wife's death, he decides to prep the army to strike back. Edward blames himself and the vengeance of God for this occurring. Egifu tries to help the king by kissing him and making love. Be a good king, not a good man, she says. This conflict continues to escalate though, guided by Ethelhelm's scheming. Unfortunately, it also means that war is coming, and with Edward sending his combined Saxon forces north, Sigtryggr also readies his army too. In the middle of all this, Uhtred realizes that Ethelhelm is the one responsible. Just as he finds out, Finan rides up and tells him about Osferth's death. With Ethelhelm's influence growing, despite his momentary lapse in faith and war on the horizon, everything is left on a precarious knife edge. Episode 6 of The Last Kingdom Season 5 starts with Steora and Sigtryggr marching on Edward and his army, intending to attack from the high hills. Edward, meanwhile, is aware of what the Danes are planning and intends to sacrifice around 300 men to circle around and take out their vanguard. It's a risky plan, and it would mean losing those men to their deaths. But in return, it could also turn the tide of this war in their favor. Uhtred and Finan, though, race up to try and stop this from happening, desperate to reveal what Ethelhelm has done. Down in Buxton, Elfwin and Elswith catch wind that war is coming, and with that the latter remains determined to bring her granddaughter to safety. She means to keep her shielded, but Elfwin hits back, venomously spitting that she's been a terrible mother to Ethelflaed. Uhtred arrives just in time, letting Edward know what Ethelhelm has done with his men. He brings up the queen's death too, and demands that Osferth's death be avenged. With this, Edward turns his attention to the villainous Ethelhelm, and stopping him no matter what. Of course, the Danes haven't received this message yet, and they continue to march on Edward and the others. Ragnvaldr suggests a perilous crossing across a frozen lake to reach them faster. He's found a passage too, and the Danes are in agreement to get the jump on Ethelhelm's camp by crossing late at night. Uhtred learns from one of Edward's scouts where the camp is, and races to get there before bloodshed marks the morning. However, he's too late as the soldiers cross the lake and strike. It's utter chaos as bloodshed grips the camp. Steora happens to be on the periphery of this, watching helplessly from afar, while Uhtred is quick to inform her of the truth around Ethelhelm's scheming. In the heat of battle, Uhtred heads in and dodges the soldiers, trying to find Ethelhelm, who has cowardly shielded himself in the middle of a shield wall. Athelstan is here fighting, though, and he more than proves himself to be a competent fighter in the wake of battle. Given Uhtred didn't want to take him out raiding, he more than proves himself here and gains respect from the soldiers. On the horizon, Edward storms into Ethelhelm's camp to tackle the Danes head-on. It's absolute carnage as fog blankets the camp from the fires that have been started. Ethelhelm predictably runs away, while Uhtred tries to find Sigtryggr to tell him what's happening. Foreshadowed earlier on with the soldiers creeping across the lake at dawn, those who retreat and run back find themselves falling in the water as the ice cracks. Eventually, when Edward and Sigtryggr come face to face, Uhtred speaks up and manages to stop this bloodshed. Uhtred speaks up on behalf of Steora and manages to spare her life, given she had no part of this fighting. Sigtryggr's fate, though, is less certain. Uhtred believes Edward should strike up a partnership with him. After all, both working together could unite all the clans as one and reclaim the shattered peace that's been broken for so long. Edward agrees, but his terms include renouncing their god and being baptized. Ragnvaldr immediately caves, but his brother is not so easily swayed. Unfortunately, that seals his fate. Sigtryggr is sentenced to death, and death by Uhtred's blade too, no less. As he plunges his sword into his gut, Sigtryggr is killed. Speaking of blades, Brida makes her choice on the road, and despite trusting Perlig this far, she changes her mind and stabs him in the stomach, taking off alone. As she flees into the wilderness, the devastating battle has one positive outcome. Athelstan is looked at as more of a leader now than he was before. Unfortunately, it comes at the cost of Steora's faith in her father. As the episode closes, Ethelhelm turns his attention toward the King of Scotia, Constantin. He intends to strike up an allegiance with him going forward. He also intends to bring Elfwin into this too, for reasons unknown at this point. Up in Scotia though, Wicker of Bebbanburg swears his loyalty to Constantin. Episode 7 of The Last Kingdom Season 5 begins with Stiorra mourning the death of Sigtryggr. It hangs heavy over her, as his sword is placed symbolically on his chest, and he's prepped for his final journey into the afterlife. The funeral rite is interrupted though when word of Brida stabbing Perlig reaches camp. In fact, he stumbles and bloodied and exhausted, warning Uhtred that Brida means to punish him, and won't rest until that happens. Uhtred is enraged and decides to try and end this, gathering his men and preparing to go after her. Uhtred visits Edward first, who's concerned about Stiorra. Given her grief, Edward deduces that it could allow more dissent in the ranks to breed, and that, in turn, could be fuel for a rebellion against him. The only way to resolve this is to swear her loyalty to Edward. If Stiorra agrees, she would rise up and be given a new purpose to lead the Danes, all under Edward's banner, of course. It's a pretty big honor, and something Uhtred realizes would help unite the lands against the ominous threats posed by both Brida and Athelholm. If Stiorra agrees, down in Macclesfield, trouble brews as Athelholm's men close in on Elfwin. Unfortunately, they walk right into their trap. They're taken away, kept alive but hidden from view, as Athelholm intends to use her as a bargaining chip. Athelholm shows in Scotia's Edward's advisor and does so without a gift. He sows the seeds of war, claiming that Edward has turned his attention northward, and that Edward is the one who had the queen murdered to justify him conquering the Danes. After the death of the Ealdormen and taking Mercia, Athelholm wants to team up and take out Edward. This would allow his grandson to ascend to the throne, promising to keep him in check and not overstep his boundaries. Not just a peace treaty, Athelholm also offers a marriage bond to Elfwin and half the riches of this land. It's certainly an enticing offer and one that Constantin seriously considers, choosing to dwell on it. In the middle of all this conflict, Egifu decides to leave and head back to Sent. Why? Well, it turns out she's pregnant. Edward blesses this though, rationalizing his wide's death so the pair can get married. So with Benedict officiating, the pair are married. However, when Ælfweard sees the pair together, he's immediately disillusioned and turns away, believing he too is to be replaced soon. As Benedict leaves, he chases after Ælfweard, who asks him for passage across to Athelholm. He brings up the Dedios as blackmail, and it seems he has no choice. Meanwhile, Stiorra decides against pledging loyalty to Edward. In front of everyone, she turns away at the last and decides to be free. Even if it's freedom to see the executioner's blade. Edward is furious and banishes Stiorra. He also decides to play Ragnvaldr in charge of the Danes instead, something that Uhtred warns against, given he could rebel. This falls on deaf ears, as Uhtred realizes that his daughter's decision could well come back to haunt them. If that wasn't bad enough, Uhtred heads outside and is given a message from Brida: come to Leutis alone. Uhtred knows this is a trap but has no choice, deciding to leave. Galloping out on his horse, Uhtred waits for Brida to show up. The fight between Brida and Uhtred eventually gets underway, but the whole affair is tinged with bittersweet regret and memories from seasons past. We've seen these two square off before, and this fight and the excellent accompanying musical score and shots from the past do such a great job capturing the magnitude of emotion that both characters are carrying at this time. Uhtred refuses to kill Brida though, even though he bests her in battle. Uhtred does manage to talk her around and urges Brida to cling to hope and see that as a path to salvation. As Brida stands up and seems to come toward the light, an arrow pierces straight through her heart. It's Stiorra. She grits her teeth and calls over to Uhtred, telling him she's done what he could not. As blood oozes out of Brida's mouth and wound, she collapses on the ground, letting out her last breath and uttering the word. Episode 8 of The Last Kingdom Season 5 starts with Uhtred mourning Brida's death. He promises to see her in Valhalla before following Stiorra. She's unhappy with Uhtred's loyalty to Brida and trying to save her, especially given Sigtryggr wasn't given the same treatment. Stiorra believes he's turned away from his family. So naturally she decides to do the same, leaving with the Danes most loyal to her. In Bebbanburg, Athelholm is visited by Ælfweard, who has been brought by Father Benedict, just as promised. Athelholm spins the idea of war into confrontation, believing that Edward will buckle under seeing Athelholm and Constantin's army. Benedict speaks up, though, when Athelholm mentions killing Edward, and how he's tyrannical, pointing out the slaughter of Danes he was responsible for. With word of Alfred's whereabouts reaching Edward, Benedict rides out to warn of what's coming. With Alfwin captured by Athelhelm, Ellsworth demands that Edward take action. However, the king opts for a more cautious approach, not wanting to rush into battle. The thing is, Ethelhelm has grand plans, which include Alfwin marrying Constantin. She promises to throw herself out the window when she hears his plan, but Athelhelm welcomes it. Scoffing, he claims it would be one less thing for him to deal with. Ottred returns to Finan and Sihtric, reflecting on what's happened so far. Ottred wants to go back home to Runcorn, but too much has happened, and the others refuse to join him unless he commands it. Having lost Stiora, Ottred wants a comforting place to call home and believes this could be it. Finan urges him not to do this and gently broaches whether there's another way. Benedict appears back in town and accepts any punishments coming his way. He warns Ottred of what Athelhelm has planned, going on to reveal that he's actually held up in Bebbanburg. This obvious piques the interest of Ottred when he finds out. Perlig sees this as a strange twist of fate, but Ottred sees it as the gods taunting him. Perlig suggests Ottred take Bebbanburg back and that the Christian god walks by his side. Ottred smiles, claiming that the gods are not by his side, but thanks the priest for his kind words nonetheless. Ottred takes this idea to Edward, suggesting they fortify Bebbanburg. Edward realizes this is a big threat and decides to come up with a more peaceful solution to prevent war. In exchange for Constantin marrying Elfwin and isolating Athelhelm away from them, he suggests splitting the region of Northumbria in two, creating a fortified area around the Scottish border. This would also mean Bebbanburg would be lost. Ottred calls him out for martyrdom and believes Edward is doing this because he's afraid. Alblin refuses to sacrifice Elfwin like Edward wants to either, and he stands with the Mercian army, and Ottred, everyone else in the council, have the same mindset, even his own son Athelstan. Edward has heard enough. He decides to shut the gates, threatening death on anyone who tries to leave. Ottred and the others shrug off the threat and promise to leave regardless of what he says. As everything is left hanging in the balance, we are left with one big question: will Edward engage in war or not? Episode 9 of The Last Kingdom Season 5 starts in York with Ottred and the others preparing to leave by sunrise. With Edward's men still barring the gates, Egifu and Ellsworth confront Edward and urge him to follow Ottred. Ellsworth realizes that he's fearful of trying to live up to Alfred's memory, but she urges her son to push through that, believing he's a good and true man. This is your destiny, seize the moment. She urges, leaving Edward to relinquish and allow Ottred and the others to ride out, only to be faced with Edward's army. He's chosen to fight for Northumbria after all, with battle coming to Bebbanburg, the place where it all began. How poetic! Athelhelm is held up in Bebbanburg, awaiting Constantin's army arriving. The king shows up from the seafront with his convoy, while Constantin's army march down to meet them. Constantin does not want to wait to attack though, and even tells Alfred not to trust any advisor, mischievously grinning. Elfwin meanwhile contemplates whether to jump to her doom or not. Constantin appears to see his bride-to-be, and she's not exactly warm toward him. The thing is, Constantin isn't happy about it either, but he's made a pact and must honor it. He consents that she's taken with another, but then so too is Constantin. They agree to be married but without love, just by arrangement. Both of them will be free to do as they please, but keep up pretenses all the same. News of Constantin's arrival reaches Edward and the army, who misjudge his timing, believing they had longer than they did. Edward is impulsive, just as Athelhelm predicted, but Ottred is there to stop him, deciding on an alternate plan to victory, rather than marching and attacking Bebbanburg head-on. After convincing Edward to stay put for now, Ottred enlists the help of Heston for this upcoming mission, which includes taking Elfwin by having Heston distract the household guard. He understands this will be difficult and time-consuming, not to mention expensive, but Heston eventually agrees when his terms are met. The thing is, Edward is restless, and it would appear that he's going to strike without waiting for Ottred. While Ottred and his men do a bit of rock climbing, sneaking in from the back, Heston puts his plan into action. He distracts the guards by claiming that his precious cargo has washed up. Salt and relics is what he carries, at least that's what he tells the soldiers anyway. Constantin allows them to help but warns them of a potential plot against them. Unfortunately, Heston is brought into the throne room to help warm up. Once here, he finds himself face to face with Athelholm. He remembers Heston from being locked in Alfred's tomb and as a result, is stuck in a precarious position. He's eventually stabbed in the gut and killed when he refuses to give up Uhtred. Kept inside and with nowhere to go, Uhtred and his men sneak in through a weakened area in the walls and immediately don outfits to blend in. Uhtred notices Wicker nearby and tries to get the jump on him, but it all goes awry, with Finan captured while Uhtred just about manages to avoid suspicion. With all hope lost, Ellsworth appears and tries to gain Stiora's favor to help. Unfortunately, Uhtred's plan seems lost when Edward rocks up outside with his vast army, surrounding the fortress. As Athelstan rides to the gates, he promises to attack and leave no one alive should they choose not to comply. The Last Kingdom Season 5, Episode 10 recap. As Edward watches his men be boiled and pitch and set alight, Constantin comes up with a plan. Rather than endure a siege which is for turds, he claims he decides to give Edward the impression that Babenberg is being abandoned, coaxing him into a frontal assault. Those in the castle will meet him head-on, while the remainder of the Scottish forces, only a mile or two down the road, will attack from the rear. It'll be catastrophic for the Saxons. In the meantime, Uhtred tasks Hild with taking Elfwin out of the castle and to the beach to rendezvous with Father Perlig on the way. She's forced to use a sword she hoped she'd never hold again to capably slash up some guard who tries to stop them. Of course, Edward walks right into the trap. As he personally marches his men to the gates of Bebbanburg, the Scots emerge from the forest behind them and attack their rear. As they're turned around to defend, Constantin and his men storm out of the gates. The Saxons are quickly overwhelmed and begin to be directed swiftly towards the cliffs. Many men fall. Aldhelm is trampled. But luckily, Uhtred spotted Stiora in the forest from the Bebbanburg ramparts and rode out to meet her. For once embracing his dual nature as both Saxon and Dane, he promises that, in victory, he will personally ensure that all Danes have homes and lands here, that they can live in peace and create a homeland for themselves. They agree, and suddenly the Scots find themselves in the middle. Taking the advantage, Edward and his men push away from the cliffs, and many Scots begin to fall. Constantin, fearing the battle may be lost, orders his men to burn Bebbanburg, but Wicker and Yaya snipe at the torchbearers with arrows. In the midst of the carnage, Edward himself is grievously injured, and Uhtred heads into the fortress to confront Wicker, with Athelstan close behind. Naturally, Wicker won't fight fair, so Uhtred has to cleave through several of his men to reach him. Meanwhile, Athelstan finds Athelholm cowering and forces him to confess to Elfward the extent of his meddling, including how his own mother's blood stains his grandfather's hands. Note: Athelstan is easily the coolest, least annoying teenager in any show in recent memory. Athelholm confesses, and Elfward tells Athelstan to do whatever with him. He wants to let him live to face the agony he has caused, but Athelholm, true to form, takes his own life. Uhtred kills Wicker, skewering him on the candelabra on his own dining table, but when he heads back outside, he finds Bebbanburg in flames. Athelstan tries to convince him to leave, but he won't abandon his birthright, his ancestral home, to the flames. He believes it is his destiny to die in Bebbanburg, and he's prepared to. But suddenly a peal of thunder ripples across the sky, and the heavens open, and it rains. The flames are extinguished, and Uhtred falls to his knees in the mud and blood, sobbing. In the aftermath of the battle, Uhtred and Constantin negotiate for peace, though we don't quite get to hear Uhtred's terms. As Constantin leaves, Edward staggers inside, and while Ellsworth tries to give him credit for the victory, Edward for once does the right thing and thanks Uhtred and the Danes for turning the tide of the battle. He congratulates Uhtred on restoring his birthright and ensures the Danes they can settle the lands in peace. But the good news doesn't last for Edward. Despite his prattling around, shaking hands and bumping cups, he's thrown for a bit of a loop when he learns why Constantin has rescinded his claims to the lands of Northumbria, because Uhtred promised that he wouldn't give them to Edward, either. Northumbria will remain between England and Scotland, a buffer to ensure peace. Eventually, all the lands will be united under a king who everyone can stand behind, but as Uhtred tells Edward to his face, he isn't that man. Uhtred raises his cup to the crowd and shouts to Bebbanburg, and his people chant his name in unison. The Last Kingdom ends with Uhtred as Lord of Northumbria, looking out from the walls of Bebbanburg, reflecting on all he has been through. A phenomenal, poignant ending indeed. You can stream The Last Kingdom Season 5 exclusively on Netflix. Do you have any thoughts on The Last Kingdom Season 5's ending? Let us know in the comments.